What it do, what it do. We are back for our third installment of After Hours. If you all aren't familiar with the concept of After Hours, it is essentially an extension of episodes that we've recorded throughout our past seasons. In this case, is a continuation of my conversation with Farai Madzima on the craft of management. We reflect a bit on my journey into design and management and the importance of paving the way for underrepresented groups into careers of design.
There has to be a way where predictably, and I was talking to a friend of mine about this, where it's like, if I'm, that 12-year-old kid, how do I know the path between me and Harrison? Or my position where Harrison is. How does my aunt know that? Whoever's going to be supporting me on that journey, how does my teacher know that? Because I think the paths that people are familiar with are the paths that are well trodden. Yeah. You know what I mean? Whereas like, cool, you want to be a teacher? There's a path. You want to be a cop? We know how to do that. You want to be an accountant? We know how to do that. But it's like, get into tech. All of a sudden, it's literally like there's a mist, there's a fog there.
As always, if anything comes to mind, you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at HMWHEELE or the Technically Speaking Twitter handle at GetTechnicalPod. Enjoy.
This is the one question I wanted to ask, which was, I don't know.
Sure.
So we've spoken a bit about my journey, from craftsperson and IC to management. What was your journey like?
I started pretty young. Like I was designing websites when I was 12 years old. I didn't actually appreciate this probably until my adult years, but my mother was actually my first boss. She told me a little bit more about the story, but she knew that I was passionate about, web design. And she actually made a proposal to make a role for me to work at the school that she was at.
What?
And so that was my summer job.
Damn.
I think there's also another pivotal moment in my life too. When I was growing up one summer, someone broke into our house and stole a bunch of stuff.
Is this in Chicago?
This was in Milwaukee. So I was born and raised in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And so when I tell you the phrase, it takes a village I mean, this is literally it. Like my dad's office donated a computer and my mom's coworkers, one of her coworkers' husbands was a computer technician. And so he was like, anything that you want in the computer, I can get it for you. And so I think this was like 96, 97. I had the 56K modem. I had a graphics card. I had like 32 megabytes of memory, it wasn't anything. Yeah. But, those were some really formative periods in my life. When I went to college, it was the first time I ever messed with Photoshop. And so I was majoring in art. And so that finally I was able to kind of marry sort of the craft of, graphic design with web. And, it's interesting, man. Like I always remember being in Iowa and I worked in a student agency and I can always remember this day. I remember these days when like Steve Jobs introduced like the iPhone. We would always we would gather around during WWDC and all the keynotes. I think at that point I was like, man, I really want to get in this tech space. I didn't know what it was. UX was not a thing at the time. After that, I was doing a lot of freelance work. And before I moved to Chicago, I got a call from Google.
Oh, word.
For a front end role. I have no idea how they found me. Like, come to think of it, like
it's Google, man. It's Google.
Yeah, it was weird, but whatever. I like flunked that interview process because it web design had kind of turned into web development, and it was becoming more of an engineering focused kind of role. And so that didn't really work out. I was kind of at this point, like, inflection point is like, do I go down this, engineering route, or do I double down and design and figure out what this UX thing is? And so I chose UX. I would not have ever expected the situation in Chicago when I was at that company for us to like move to California. Even though I had dreams of moving there, I didn't know it was going to manifest itself that way. at that point I was managing the team, building the team, learning all the recruiting, how that worked, building a design process, case studies, like those were a new thing as well. So like seeing designers kind of start doing these types of things out of HCI programs, you know, I was like, whoa, this is a lot, you know, because I didn't have that education. Like I had to like literally learn on my own and just do it, learn by doing. And there was always curiosity. I'd always really been thinking about how I could approach design at scale. And that's thematically throughout, you know, my youth all the way into my adulthood. I think I brought this up in the interview with Brooks, but I'll just never forget when that recruiter from Google was sitting across from me in Mountain View. Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, that was all like fate, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But I was like, okay, like this is everything that I wanted to do in life. And, you know, I'd say like right now, man, you know, you touched on this, on the human aspect of managing, right? And being able to see, and over time, being able to see designers really mature and develop and reach their own highest potential. I mean, I think that's one of the most fulfilling things, right? Absolutely. And you know, I think the sky's the limit in terms of any product that we work on when everyone is reaching their highest potential. And so, you know, I try to figure out how we can create environments for that, not only them, but also for everyone else on those teams too, right? Because, you know, not everyone has the opportunity to work in tech. And, you know, I definitely realize that making those pathways available where it isn't as meandering, where it's not just chance, where you can grow up knowing that you can be this and take purposeful action to get there.
Yeah. Man, thanks so much for sharing that story. You know, the opportunities that we get as kids and, you know, those things that happen that, you know, open these doors for us. I guess you can't predict it, but as you say, it does need to be more like that, right? Because, and I guess this conversation touches a bit on, I mean, 2020 has been a year of that, but, you know, getting more folks, you know, who are people of color, you know, we can't keep relying on chance, right? There has to be a way where predictably, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine about this, where it's like, if I'm, you know, that 12-year-old kid, how do I know the path between me and Harrison? You know, or my position where Harrison is? How does my aunt know that? Whoever's going to be supporting me on that journey, how does my teacher know that? Because I think the paths that people are familiar with are the paths that are well trodden. You know what I mean? Whereas like, cool, you want to be a teacher? There's a path. You want to be a cop? We know how to do that. You want to be an accountant? We know how to do that. But it's like, get into tech. All of a sudden, it's literally like there's a mist, there's a fog there. Yeah. And, you know, on the other side, people sometimes emerge, sometimes they bounce back and nobody knows, you know, how to get through. So absolutely, I agree that, you know, the more we can make these paths clear for folks, and the more we can kind of plant the seeds for people who are trying to come up, I think that's a really important thing for, you know, in the work that we do and in the organizations that we're in to be able to amplify.
There are many different areas to really kind of focus on. You know, I think making this podcast accessible is kind of one of the small things that I think I can do. But, you know, through curriculum, through representation at the leadership levels, right? That's so important. Like this conversation on how to become a manager, in my experience, relatability is so important. And to see somebody that looks like you in these positions goes a long way, because, you know, you believe that now you can achieve those types of things, right? The more enlightenment that we provide for people is that they're going to see this progress in their careers a lot quicker, like a lot quicker than we've been able to realize. You don't got to move to 4 countries
to see it. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, your point around representation is critical. Let me ask you, how many Black managers have you had?
Ooh, I don't think I haven't had one.
And how long have you been in the game?
It's been about 8 years. If we talk about design and web, and I mean, most of my life, as crazy as it sounds, my mom was my only manager who was Black.
Can you imagine that, sir? Right? Yeah. You've been in the game for that long and not a single Black manager. I'll tell you what, it's the same for me. I started doing this 2004.
Hmm.
15 years. My math sucks. 16 years.
Yeah.
No black managers.
Yeah.
Right. That's what we're working with. When you talk about representation, it's like, how does that play out? Obviously, and I really do appreciate the fact that, you're making this podcast and you're trying to, at least expose some of, the folks that are here, the folks that are doing this, to be like, cool, there are people out there who are doing this. It needs to be seen. And at least this is one avenue that folks can look at and go, oh, snap, that's where they are.
Yeah. Hey, Farai, if there's one thing actually that I'd give to folks listening, that really resonated with me is, I think it's important for everyone in the industry to just take some time to pause and just do a bit of self-reflection and ask those types of questions. Right. When you look at, have you ever had a black manager, right? Or how many black folks have you worked with? Or how much percentage of the industry, are black, or even people of color for that matter, right? Like, I think once you start to take the time to understand it, you should realize something is really off, right? And if you are in these types of positions, you do have the power to have a voice, and it's important to keep practicing that voice. Yeah. It may be hard at first, it may be a little bit awkward, but it matters. And you speaking up is going to encourage another person. And before you know it, it'll snowball and you might have a movement. I think these types of conversations are important to kind of keep moving because, personally, this is work that I enjoy. This is an industry that I want to go to bat for, right? I want to envision an industry that is also inclusive and representative, just like the values that they preach every single day.
I love the point that you raised around the reflection. There's been a lot of big, like huge world problems that have been raised. But I think, when you say everyone can take a moment to reflect, we can just look at ourselves and look around us. We don't have to try and change the world. We don't have to try and, I heard the phrase, boil the ocean. But rather, wherever we're at, look around us, look around our teams. We don't need to go further than that. And just see what influence you can have at that level. That's something that we, that's within our sphere of control. That's where we can have impact. And if more and more people are doing that, as you say, hopefully that will bubble up into something important. There's something that I've been learning recently, since earlier this year, when there was the phrase systemic racism was being used a lot in a whole bunch of areas. And I was trying to figure out, if there are systemic issues, where are the systemic solutions? Like, what does it mean to solve a system? In these, when these things come up, we love to point a finger and be like, there, that's where the problem is. This is where the problem is. But if we've learned anything from climate change or pollution, you don't solve that by pointing at, oh, it's the plastic. Oh, it's the cars. You know what I mean? It's not. Yeah. It's a huge system. And you need to understand. You have to understand the system, the dynamics of the system, the players in the system, and then be like, cool, we need to focus on this particular leverage point or these leverage points to change the system. And I think there's a longer conversation that needs to be had around, okay, cool. If we are seeing systemic issues that are stopping people like you and I from joining this industry, from becoming managers and leaders and owners in this industry, what does that system look like? Yeah. Right. And we can use our design tools to explore that system. We can use our design tools to map that system and draw it out so that we can be like, cool, you see, this is how things flow. We can prototype that and be like, cool, if you stop that flow, what could happen over here? Right. That's, those models will be crude, but as designers, we have the skills to try and understand these problems at a larger scale than just, I'm looking at HR and saying it's HR's fault, you know what I mean, or whatever. But we have, but we have the tools to start to understand at a system level what's going on, to try and map that for other people to look at and go, actually, you can't just point at one thing. See how all these things are interrelated. Now let's talk about what could we leverage, what could we try and shift and run some experiments. These are all things within the design toolkit, right? That we could be thinking about, that we could be using and saying, could you innovate around trying to solve these problems? Could you use some of those tools? Could you build, measure, learn nothing? Those are things I'm interested in hearing, and talking about and seeing how we can try and use that to tackle these systemic issues as opposed to the finger pointing or the guilting or, because none of those, I think, help us to move forward in terms of what we're trying to do.
To that point, in order for these things to happen, investment of time and resources need to be made. Because having the conversation is great, but I think action is ultimately what will lead to these results, right? So, man, I think there's a good conversation to have, and hopefully, it can inspire folks to do meaningful action. It's going to take a collective effort, right?
Oh yeah.
And if to your point around inclusivity in terms of organizations, when we talk about the future that we want to imagine, I mean, it benefits everybody.
For sure.
Enjoy this episode? Be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast platform that you use. You can also subscribe to my newsletter at harrisonwheeler.com for the latest industry insights, new article posts, and announcements of future guests on the show. Once again, thanks for listening to this episode of Technically Speaking. I'm your host, Harrison Wheeler, and I'm out.